There's your notification. Okay, we're live. Admitting participants now.
Everyone, we're going to get started in just a moment. Some of you are still getting into the room, into the Zoom rather.
I'll stop screen sharing in like 10 seconds.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joel Whitney. It's nice to be with you tonight. You can hear me okay? Yeah, great. So I'm so pleased to welcome you all. I'm with the library's BPL Presents, and this is our series called Second Read, examining the wonders and sometimes the deficiencies of that idea that's maybe both fictional and real of a canon of world literature in English, mostly. Tonight's contestant is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which will be discussed in a lively debate with Tom Roston, Ginger Strand, and Dan Simon, moderated by Esquire's Adrian Westenfeld. We'll go over their ample credentials and relationships with Vonnegut in a moment. But the immediate or inciting book for tonight is Tom Roston's The Writer's Crusade, which you can order from our partners at Greenlight Bookstore. We'll drop that in the chat in a moment, so you can order it. We also will call out another recent book by Ginger Strand, The Brothers Vonnegut. We'll put the link from Greenlight Bookstore in the chat for that one as well. Let's see, this is a series that we wanted to have. We started a while ago. We wanted to do an Oxford-style debate around authors of books over very, very specific questions. But in the months right before the nearly 2-year pandemic, we've somewhat loosened the format to kind of a traditional panel around a particular book. We do, of course, encourage our panelists to risk disagreeing, and when you get a chance to speak, which you will, sometime in the second half of the hour, about 7:45-ish, we hope, 7:50, depending on how things go. We would also encourage you to feel free to disagree, agree, make your points, comments, questions are all welcome. Past writers and books to get the second read treatment were Lord of the Flies by William Golding, The Color Purple by Alice Walker, Leaves of Grass by Whitman, the work of Susan Sontag, Audre Lorde's work, and most recently Ernest Hemingway, based on the recent documentary on PBS. Considering these predecessors, how will Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five hold up? So before introducing those weighing in, I want to let you know how to keep in touch with us, how to come to other events like this. Our handle on social media, again, is BPL Presents, and we'll drop those all in the chat. And our web calendar is bklynlibrary.org/BPL Presents. Coming up, we have things like our Con Humanities lecture with Amitav Ghosh on December 8th, an international writer series that will feature Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk from Poland, streaming there in English from Poland, the Booker winner Ben Okri, and ongoing music, film, and visual arts series, not to mention our talks around our newest branch at the Center for Brooklyn History, formerly Brooklyn Historical Society. So please come back. All to say that. Now back to Slaughterhouse-Five. A snippet of how this book reads. You go reading through it, you go from meditation on warfare, the foibles of America, science fiction, you go into the perverse, and as Tom Roston points out in his book, you go into a style of new journalism of the 1960s that Vonnegut used to create kind of a new kind of almost metafictional novel, but also opening up its voice in a very democratic way, the way Whitman opened his poems to ordinary Americans at leisure, say, in a park. What I like is how it deals with very difficult questions of war trauma, war crimes, with sometimes, very silly parts, total lack of pretentiousness in the voice of Vonnegut and his various alter egos. I loved this book when I was young, and you know, it's about a very awful thing, a war crime, as I'm sure most of you know. All of you probably have read it, the firebombing of Dresden that Vonnegut experienced and its aftermath. My name is Jan Janssen. I live in Wisconsin. I work in a lumber yard there. You see, Vonnegut just sort of breaks into these, whenever he finds himself getting too serious, he goes into these sidebars and digressions. But I'm going to give some quotes that stuck with me, and you know, one of our panelists will do the same. Americans, like human beings everywhere, Vonnegut writes, quoting the fictitious monograph, I think, of playwright and Nazi propagandist Howard Campbell, who debuts in Mother Night. Americans believe many things that are obviously untrue. Their most destructive untruth is that it is very easy for any American to make money. They will not acknowledge how, in fact, hard money is to come by, and therefore those who have no money blame and blame and blame themselves. This inward blame has been a treasure for the rich and powerful, who have had to do less for their poor, publicly and privately, than any other ruling class since, say, Napoleonic times. Many novelties have come from America. The most startling of these, a thing without precedent, is a mass of undignified poor. They do not love one another because they do not love themselves. Well, we should. Vonnegut also writes in the mouth of Billy Pilgrim, the time-traveling optometrist who has become unstuck in time, why me? And that is a very earthling question to ask, Mr. Pilgrim, say the Tralfamadorians who sort of kidnap him. Why you? Why us, for that matter? Why anything? Because this moment simply is. Have you ever seen bugs trapped in amber? Yes. Well, here we are, Mr. Pilgrim, trapped in the amber of this moment. There is no why. Then Vonnegut writes, like so many Americans, she was trying to construct a life that made sense from things she found in gift shops. On veterans, he writes, the nicest veterans, the kindest and funniest ones, the ones who hated war the most, were the ones who'd really fought. So our panelists will take this further. Dan Simon at Seven Stories is one of Kurt Vonnegut's 3 editors. Others were Seymour Lawrence at Delacorte and Faith Sale at Putnam Penguin. Dan edited Vonnegut's last major work, A Man Without a Country, as well as a number of other titles before and after Vonnegut's death in 2007, including Complete Stories and If This Isn't Nice, What Is? Pity the Reader, God Bless You, Dr. Kevorkian, and with Lee Stringer, Like Shaking Hands with God. Simon is the founder and publisher of Seven Stories Press and writes long-form essays for The Nation. He is the co-author of a biography of Abbie Hoffman, Run, 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 The Lives of Abbie Hoffman, and translator of Van Gogh, The Self-Portraits by Pascal Bonnafou. Ginger Strand is the author of 1 novel, 2 opera librettos, and 3 books of narrative nonfiction, most recently The Brothers Vonnegut, Science and Fiction in the House of Magic. That book, The Brothers Vonnegut, about Kurt and his scientist brother Bernard, was called, quote, A Quantum Leap Forward in Kurt Vonnegut Studies by Jerome Klinkowitz, Review in American Literary History. And the only good book written about Kurt Vonnegut, said Dan Wakefield, but that was, of course, until now. She has published essays in a wide range of places, including Harper's, The New Yorker, The Believer, Tin House, and Orion, in addition to writing frequently about the collisions between nature, culture, and science, science and the arts. She frequently collaborates with photographers and has contributed essays to photography projects by Lisa Koreski, Joshua Dudley Greer, and the Magnum Agency's Postcards from America. And The Writer's Crusade, Kurt Vonnegut and the Many Lives of Slaughterhouse-Five, is the book that allowed us to do this. It's also, next year, by the way, is 100 years since Vonnegut's birth, and there's, as you probably saw, a new documentary coming. But Tom Roston's book, The Writer's Crusade, is sort of our triggering incident for this. Roston previously spent 3 years researching, reporting, and writing the most spectacular restaurant in the world. Roston has been writing and editing stories about culture, food, and life in New York City for more than 20 years. He's profiled a long list of dynamic subjects, from documentarian Ken Burns to actor Tom Cruise, from chef Jose Andres to Judge Judy. He drove across Montana with Viggo Mortensen, got tattoos, not matching, with Angelina Jolie in Montreal, drank whiskey with Jane Goodall, and translated Khmer words into English for Kurt Vonnegut himself. In The Quantum Prophets, he sought to uncover what lies beneath the intellectual battle between Richard Dawkins and Deepak Chopra. In I Lost It at the Video Store, Filmmaker's Oral History of a Vanished Era, he constructed a narrative chronicle of a creative movement from interviews with filmmakers such as Tarantino, Kevin Smith, Darren Aronofsky, David O. Russell, and Allison Anders. And finally, our moderator today is Adrienne Westenfeld, an editor at Esquire, where she writes about books and culture, commissions and edits fiction, and curates the Esquire Book Club. Her work has appeared in Esquire, Town and Country, and Elle, among other places. Adrienne, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Joel. Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank our panelists for being here and also thank you, our audience, for joining us tonight. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. We're going to open with a few readings. First up, Dan is going to share a very special passage from Slaughterhouse-Five with us. So Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Adrienne. This is from chapter 4 of Slaughterhouse, just to get us in the mood, a bit about being unstuck in time. Seen backwards by Billy. The story went like this. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses took off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew at them backwards, sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen. They did the same for wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes. They used them to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair. Over France, though, German fighters came up again, made everything and everybody as good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating day and night, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them into the ground, to hide them cleverly, so they would never hurt anybody ever again.
Thank you, Dan. Next up, Ginger is going to share a passage from the Brothers Vonnegut.
Thank you. This is the opening page and a half. Private First Class Vonnegut prepared to die. At the bottom of a snowy hollow, he fixed his bayonet and waited, huddled in a group of roughly 50 soldiers. Their unit, the 423rd, had been at battle for 3 days. They'd been lost for most of it. Now they were surrounded, herded into a small depression in the unfamiliar land. Kurt hunched into his coat. He had a tall man's habit of hunching, but he couldn't get warm. That December 1944 was one of the coldest and wettest ever recorded in Europe. The Germans were shouting at them. Kurt and the other soldiers could hear accented voices telling the Americans to give up. They were surrounded, the Nazis said. It was useless to resist. The men bunched together, pointing their bayonets out the way soldiers do in the movies. Time slowed down. Kurt had always liked being part of a clan, and here, at the end of the line, the soldiers became almost one being, a big porcupine bristling with steel quills. For a few minutes, it was kind of nice. He had waded ashore to the European theater less than a month earlier and ground to the front in a truck buffeted by sleet. He was still somewhat in shock. His mother had died of a drug overdose. Was it a suicide, an accident? Just before he shipped out. The sadness hung thick over his departure, complicating and deepening his fear. Still, for the first time in his life, he felt beyond reproach. No longer a flunking chemistry student or a college dropout. He was a soldier putting his life on the line. He was now the sort of person honored in the grandiose Soldiers and Sailors Monument at the center of his hometown, Indianapolis. Not even his big brother, Bernard, could say that much. Bernie, the A student, the brilliant scientist, the MIT man like their father, the one who launched the chain of events that landed Kurt here, a pacifist about to be swallowed by war. The Germans fired on the trees above the soldier's head. Branches and splintered steel rained down. A couple of guys were hit. They might be dead. 25 years later, Kurt would introduce a character named Edgar Derby to the world and describe his experience of this very battle. He would call what rained down on him, quote, the incredible artificial weather that earthlings sometimes create for other earthlings when they don't want those earthlings to inhabit Earth anymore. Come out, the Nazis ordered again. The Americans came out. When he saw the Germans, Kurt couldn't help but note their white snowsuits. That made so much more sense, he thought, than his absurd army drab. The Americans were always in olive, as if wars were never fought in white places, in white weather.
Thank you, Ginger. And finally, Tom's going to read a bit from the Writers' Crusade.
That's right. And before I do, I just want to thank the Brooklyn Public Library, not just for holding on this event, but also for being a great resource for me while I was writing this book. I, at any given time, had about 20 books out from the library, which is just a stone's throw from me, including Ginger's book, which is a fantastic book. So thank you, Brooklyn Public Library, especially Joel and Chloe Wasserman. So I'm going to read this to you. This is my book. Talks about how Slaughterhouse-Five is definitely worth reading, a second read, and how it really tells us a lot about trauma. And I use Tim O'Brien, the writer Tim O'Brien, as a complement and as a parallel to better understand Vonnegut's work. So that's why it starts with, in the How to Tell a War Story chapter of The Things They Carried, Tim O'Brien writes, in war, you lose your sense of the definite, hence your sense of truth itself. And therefore, it's safe to say that in a true war story, nothing much is ever very true. Often in a true war story, there is not even a point. From a different angle, Vonnegut articulates a similar sentiment in the first chapter of Slaughterhouse-Five, when he writes, there is nothing intelligent to be said about a massacre. In the book, Vonnegut does not explicitly describe the horrors of war, but instead uses elision, misdirection, and irony to relay its devastation. In a later chapter, he muses that, quote, everything was beautiful and nothing hurt, would be a great epitaph for both himself and the character Billy Pilgrim. But we know that nothing could be further from the truth. In order to strip anything redeeming from his story, be it pathos, glory, or moralizing, Vonnegut sought to implode the narrative process. Jerome Klinkowitz, who was mentioned earlier, a Vonnegut scholar who has written many books about the works by the author, says, quote, Slaughterhouse-Five is principally a book about itself being written and itself being read. In other words, Vonnegut recognized that the war story itself had to be undone in order for it to be truthful. By doing so, he provided a salve to war veterans, including himself. Not that he would have characterized the book's impact in such deliberate, do-good fashion. Instead, Vonnegut liked to crack that the only benefit from the Dresden Massacre went to him financially. Quote, I wrote this book, which earned a lot of money for me and made my reputation such as it is. One way or another, I got $2 or $3 for every person killed. Some business I'm in. And I'm just going to jump to one last graph just to try to indicate why I think this book is so relevant today. Just one paragraph here. Vonnegut provided us with a beacon that has time traveled unscathed from the past. The author's 2-decade struggle to write a book that depicts the trauma of war truthfully, without cheapening it, anticipated the PTSD diagnosis. Quote, Slaughterhouse-Five is the ultimate PTSD novel, says Duke University professor and psychiatrist Harold Cudler, who is also a VA consultant. Quote, it is a fully rendered metaphorical exploration of what it means to be ripped out of your own person, relationships, place, and time, written by a man who had actually experienced this.
Thank you, Tom. I want to start by situating Slaughterhouse-Five in our current context. What we do here at Second Reads is make the case for why and how a book endures over time. It's often called one of the great anti-war novels. When it was published in 1969, it spoke not just to one war, to World War II, but it also spoke to the Vietnam War. How should we think about it in the age of our never-ending war, the Iraq War? Why should it remain widely read in this day and age?
I mean, I'll take that to start. For my book, I interviewed many veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. Many people, many soldiers, younger soldiers, carry that book around with them from one camp to another because it spoke to them. And it speaks to this notion of trauma. I think what's so brilliant about Slaughterhouse-Five is that it was able to anticipate PTSD, even though PTSD came out as a diagnosis in 1980. It's because Vonnegut understood what trauma was, because I believe that he experienced trauma himself at World War II. And so today we live in this society where trauma is constantly being talked about, so usually legitimately, but you go to a barista who burns you with her coffee, and you say you're traumatized by it. So there's constantly a discussion about it, but he was able to I think anticipate this discussion in ways that it's very illuminating.
It's also, I think, important that it's just a great work of literature. It's amazingly well written, and every time I read it, I find things that I haven't found before. And I don't think that takes away at all from the fact that it is an incredibly thoughtful and in-depth depiction of PTSD and the experience of that. I think that's how literature works. It's both and.
Mhm.
Yeah,
To
I mean, I would say
complicate
that.
what you're saying a bit here,
Go
Tom.
ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. No, finish your thought.
I mean, I think, when you have a discussion like this, you start talking about the meaning and the purpose and the relevance, and it becomes just like Ginger is saying, fiction is written really out of imagination, right? Out of a creative impulse, and it's supposed to bring us to some other place through creativity. And so when we talk about lessons, it sort of, in a way, it kind of belittles or demeans the actual achievement. But I mean, I think, but I still think, like you're saying, Ginger, I think we could do both.
Mhm. When we look at this through the lens of Vonnegut's trauma, I think it's a slippery picture. He gave an interesting interview. I'm going to quote him here. He once said, "The importance of Dresden in my life has been considerably exaggerated because my book about it became a bestseller. If the book hadn't been a bestseller, it would seem like a very minor experience in my life, and I don't think people's lives are changed by short-term events like that. Dresden was astonishing, but experiences can be astonishing without changing you." What should we make of his own kind of refusal to describe his experience as traumatic? How does that change how we read the book?
I think, Dan, you're the one who knew him of us, right? So
Yeah, so I mean, thanks. So I mean, when we were publishing A Man Without a Country, 2005, I went with Kurt to most of his interviews. Somebody from Seven Stories went to every interview, and I did most of them. Our publicity director did the others, and we always had to kind of read the riot act to the journalist ahead of time. You are not to talk about Dresden, and you are not to talk about Kurt's mother's suicide. And invariably, Kurt brought up both things. And I remember, on one occasion he was interviewed by a German journalist who was from Dresden. And, it was really interesting. And his parents still wouldn't talk about Dresden, still basically denied that it happened. But so I think, for Kurt, what needs to be said is this book is Kurt healing himself. I mean, maybe that's implied, Tom, when you talk about it as a PTSD book, but he was absolutely going to write a book about his war experiences. That was great material. He was a writer. He came back for 20 years. He was trying to figure out how to do it, but being the great writer that he was, he had to do it in some way that was true to himself and true to his standards, but also just kind of captured was a snapshot of him, of the person. And so, I think it's less a book about this horrible thing that happened as a book about somebody who saved himself. It was him coming through as a human being, coming through as a more or less happy human being, depressive, but, and I don't think Charles Shields understands this, but Kurt was, obviously incredibly prolific, incredibly loving person, good friend, very gregarious. He wasn't like a mopey guy. He was somebody who lived with depression and never imposed that depression on his friends or on anyone. very important to Kurt always to be a good date, what he called being a good date. So you could spend, an afternoon with him and you just never were brought down. He just didn't do that. It was a miracle, really. So, I think, getting back to what Ginger said before, Slaughterhouse-Five is a masterpiece because, Kurt Vonnegut is to American literature what James Joyce is to, Irish literature. It's a purist stylist, and anybody can understand it. And, what I was thinking about a lot today, kind of before this event is, if it's a PTSD book, why is it so meaningful to so many millions of readers and new generations? So he's connecting to this kind of life force in all of us, so everyone, young people today, we live in a kind of traumatized society, right? But what Slaughterhouse-Five does, it's such a life-saving book for so many people because, it's kind of how to be a human being in a time where we're surrounded by that kind of trauma. And, don't forget, it's a hilariously funny book. Even the passage that I read, how ingenious and how funny to talk about an act of war, genocidal war, and to imagine it being a healing process. Unbelievable, So I forget what the question was, but I don't want us to get kind of bogged down thinking of it as a depressing book. It's the furthest thing from a depressing book. It's a life-giving book to everybody who reads it and reads it over and over again. And young people discovering it again today, which they continuously do. It's one of the few books that gets rediscovered by each new generation. It's because it's a freeing book. It's free stylistically, it's free emotionally. The thing about Kurt, and then I'll stop, is that, what I learned from Kurt is that whatever it is, whatever the demon is or the monster is, it's harming you much more if you don't look at it. If it's in the closet, if it's under the bed, it will terrify you. If you look at it in the face, which is of course also what Kurt is doing in this book, it's not so bad. You can live through it.
Well, I would differ a little bit on that. Just I've thought about this. Judith Herman, who wrote a lot about trauma, has this great quote about psychological trauma, that it's the central conflict or the central dialectic of trauma is the need to deny the trauma and the need to proclaim it. And this dialectic that's what makes it so difficult, because this awful thing happened, you want to deny it, but then you need to proclaim it. But my take, and I think a lot of people, I'm not the only one, my take on Slaughterhouse-Five is that he didn't face it, like you said, Dan. He didn't face it straight on. He used dark humor. He used irony. He used this, this story of aliens and time travel to make fun of it. And that's what actually makes it such a magical book, because you can read the book. So many people I know who read this book thought, oh, it was fun. It was a fun book to read. And I'm like, what? This is the saddest book I've ever read. But most people do read it, like you said, it's fun. It's a fun read.
Well, that's really,
but it's because he doesn't face it straight on. That's exactly why.
That's super interesting. And you do talk a lot about it in your book, Judith Herman and all, but don't you think it does both? That's the miracle, is it really does both, and it is both. It's like, yeah, you can say, the Tralfamadorian, thing, it's completely turning away from it, but he also looks it in the face. It's really, I believe both. I would counter what you just said, saying, yeah, okay, but these two things are not mutually exclusive.
Well, I do agree with you that it depends on the reader, right? I think for many of us who read the book zillions of times, I think you start seeing it from different angles. But if you're a 17-year-old kid, like most people who first read this book, reading it, you might just see it as a fun trip.
I think that going back to the question that Adrian kind of brought up, about I hate to use the word, but like the universality of it, the fact that people who have no experience of war and no experience of trauma, or, well, we're all traumatized in various ways, right? But it's really, the subtitle is A Duty Dance with Death, right? And the book is about death, and everyone has that trauma to deal with and think about. And so you can kind of, it meets you wherever you are.
It's a beautiful way
Right.
to.
But
Very much
Tom,
so.
not to be argumentative, but I mean, the young people, you know, one of my daughter's best friends is obsessed with Vonnegut. My son is obsessed with Vonnegut, read everything. My daughter knew him, of course, but these are not people having a light read. You know, what is so satisfying for them to discover or immerse themselves in Kurt is it really touches them deeply. In other words, it speaks to that part of them that may be depressed and kind of has this kind of life-saving magic to it. You know, it's not, you know, you can think of other writers, including from that period, that are just hilarious and are light, you know, Confederacy of Dunces, or, you know, anything. There's so many books that are just funny and well-written and brilliant. But, you know, Slaughterhouse-Five it's not, I don't think anybody discovering it thinks of it as a light read, but it's more like a soulful, healing, and very funny, and the Black humor, you know, but I just think, yeah, it touches them deeply.
You know, it's
Nick,
interesting.
Go ahead.
It's interesting that we're talking so much about young people, because this is often a book that is assigned in school and that people discover at that age of 16 or 17. But it's also been subject to this never-ending campaign to ban the book in schools. Currently, it's ranked number 29 on the American Library Association's list of banned or challenged books. There's an anecdote from 1973 where in North Dakota, they threw 32 copies in the school's coal burner. You know, when book banning is a cyclical thing, and I think it keeps happening because something about these books strikes a nerve. What is it about Slaughterhouse-Five that is too hot to handle in some school systems? What nerve does it keep touching that parts of our culture are not ready to go there?
I think all of Vonnegut touches that kind of nerve, because he doesn't take the culture seriously. And I think that's possibly what attracts young people to this voice as well, is a voice that's just like ready to burn it down. And it's revolutionary. The first people who translated the Brothers Vonnegut the first foreign rights sold to Hungary. And I got an email from the translator saying, I don't know if you know this, but Vonnegut is worshipped in Hungary because we all read him under communism. And for some reason, the communists thought that he was not subversive, that it's just silly cartoon character, comic book stuff with space aliens and everything. And we all read it, understanding that it was a critique of the culture at large, and we loved it. So that was fascinating to me to hear.
It's interesting to hear you say he doesn't take the culture serious. I guess that's true. He also doesn't take himself seriously.
Right.
You know, I mean, he does in a sense, but I mean, it's always dual, you know, kind of pairs of contradictions, but he certainly is disarmingly funny about himself. I mean, oh my God, I don't know if anybody's done that before, just kind of to the extent that he did. And of course, he was a really popular on campuses, you know, commencement address giver. He was, look, he used to say, we are performing animals. We're performing animals. He always put on a good show.
Mm-hmm. Thinking about when young people pick up this book in this day and age, you know, young people have such a changed relationship to technology than young people in Vonnegut's time. And Tom, in your book, you quote the writer Steve Almond taking note of how Vonnegut was very concerned about our big brains and the danger posed by science and technology. Ginger, this got me thinking about your book and how you have delved so extensively into Vonnegut's relationship to those subjects. I'd love to hear more from you on that. What evidence of his thinking on science and technology do we see in Slaughterhouse-Five?
He said, go ahead, Ginger.
It's, you know, it's funny because I was looking at it before this event and I realized briefly, he gives a disquisition on photography and how it was, when it was invented and how it works, so that they coat the thing with silver iodide, which is of course relates to Bernard Vonnegut's method for seeding clouds. And Vonnegut himself would often point out in many of those later essays, especially, that he was conversant in science. He was, trained as a chemist, or trained as in chemistry at Cornell. So he had this knowledge of science that you kind of have to look for, because it comes through with this very light touch in his work, but it's there. And I think he's, because he's constantly thinking about the ramifications of science, and I think were he alive today, he would be thinking about technology and social media in the same way. As a humanist, what is this doing to our humanity, basically, which is a huge concern of his.
Yeah, he said somewhere along the way that his books are primarily about the responsibility of, he would have said, man, to deal with the responsibility of technology and how it's just getting away from them, because he was so distraught by the atom bomb and what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that really was what he was writing about through most of his books. And I do think you're totally right that he would have been really interested in social media, because I mean, it's, and what you were, Adrian, that quote, I think the rest of that quote from Steve Almond, he and I were talking about how Slaughterhouse-Five is about a character, Billy Pilgrim, with a fractured identity. He's experiencing disassociation. So he's in one place and another. He's in time, he's out of time, he's here, he's there, which is exactly where we're always today with our phones. You're sitting next to someone on a couch, then they're a million miles away from you, or 1,000 years away from you. And so it's this incredible thing where the book itself, that's about a soldier experiencing these things, are very much what we're experiencing now with our little smartphones.
And his very first novel that he wrote in the kind of traumatized period immediately following the dropping of the atomic bombs, Player Piano, is completely a novel about technology and our relationship to it. And then I'll just make a pitch for one of the later novels that I think is underappreciated, is Galapagos, which is also the concern about our big brains and this notion that sometime in the future we'll devolve back into something much pleasanter that lives in the ocean.
And in fact, he has a little gadget in that story that is almost like a Steve Jobs iPhone, that tells you everything you need to know.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's another thing that he was able to anticipate.
Looking at the science of it all, I want to talk about the designation of this book as a science fiction novel. Vonnegut had an uneasy relationship with that term. I love this quote. He said, "I became a so-called science fiction writer when someone decreed that I was a science fiction writer. Ever since, I have been a sore-headed occupant of a file drawer labeled science fiction, and I would like out, particularly since so many serious critics regularly mistake the drawer for a urinal." How should we look at Slaughterhouse-Five on the science fiction continuum? Is it fair to call it a science fiction novel?
I don't think it is.
Go on.
Yeah, I'm with you. I agree.
I think he uses science fictional, and he did sometimes write things and try to sell them to magazines like Astounding Science and stuff like that. But he's here in particular, he's using it as a literary device. I might say something different about, say, Sirens of Titan. I think that actually fits into the category science fiction, but this doesn't.
I mean, I think the whole notion of genre is a swamp, or it's a dangerous thing to get into, because what he was reacting to was this notion of being not heard or not listened to. And so as soon as you start putting someone into a box, then he's not in any other boxes, right? And I don't think that's fair. I think that's one of the things I think we're talking about tonight is like, is it fair to read Vonnegut this, today? And if we start saying he's a science fiction writer or he's from the 20th century canon, immediately some people are going to say, well, okay, I don't want to have anything to do with him. And that's what we're trying to break down those barriers. So ideally, I would say you can call it science fiction if you want to call it science fiction. You can call it genre or not. It's great literature. That's what it is.
Also, I'll just say it was very real to Kurt, this stuff. It wasn't just like, I mean, look, again, another contradiction. Yes, he really worked out his jokes and his performances. He worked really hard, multiple drafts. He really thought about it. When we did, would go to a show like the Comedy Central show, which in 2005, he had worked out his top 10 list. He came super prepared. But at the same time, he really experienced, this was, I mean, again, maybe this supports your PTSD theory, but these things that you say, oh, gee, isn't that, clever or whatever, he experienced life that way. I remember being in a car with him going across town, in fact, to that same show. George Bush was in town at the Waldorf Astoria. You just couldn't get anywhere. And Kurt said he was miserable in the car. And he said, we're never going to get out of this car. He regretted that he was doing the show, everything. We're never going to get out of this car. We have to understand about Kurt is at that moment, he believed that he was never going to get out of that car. I mean, he really believed it. That was his experience of that moment. I was with him another time downtown where we just came out of a interview at WNYC, and there had been a demonstration nearby, and there were floods of people coming by, just masses of people. And again, we're never going to get out of here. He said, I'm going to go get a hotel. I'm just going to stay here because we're never going to get out of here. And this was really his experience. Maybe on some level he knew that, time would pass and it would get better, but that wasn't how he was experiencing the moment. So this stuff, this clever idea that he has of being unstuck in time and Billy Pilgrim and all that, Kurt never wrote an autobiography, but these are all snapshots of, what we are, delighted by and find, extreme meaning in a book like Slaughterhouse-Five is Kurt as a person, and his great success is being able to get that down on paper here. It's really who he was at that moment in 1969, finishing the book, as you write, Tom, 2 days after Robert Kennedy is assassinated, and a beautiful passage, which I'd never seen before, where he compares himself to a flower that has just had its one blooming, has just bloomed. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said he feels like that flower. He's done what he was put on earth to do in completing Slaughterhouse-Five. So, if we love the book, it's because we love Kurt.
I'd love to. Adrian, I'm thinking about your question about science fiction, and it is something that was always in my mind as I was working on my book. And Dan, you publish him. So I hope you guys don't mind if I kind of throw this out there. Is it relevant for people, or should people be reading or rereading a 20th century white heterosexual male novel when we're trying to make room? This is an era. I mean, Dan, you've got a very progressive publishing house, right? But we live in an era now where the industry is trying to make room for people of color and women and trans writers. How do we balance this discussion, the fact that we're dedicating this time to this old white guy?
I think it's a non-issue. We publish a lot of trans authors, we publish a lot of Black authors, et cetera. And to me, to deprive this moment when, the industry, which is very closed industry, is more open to, a really diverse, group of authors, which we should be, to deprive them of Kurt Vonnegut, to deprive them of Nelson Algren, to deprive them of, Annie Ernaux, whoever it might be, would be a great disservice. So I think, if you're a young BIPOC author coming up, I mean, it's like take from everybody. And of course you want to read Algren, of course you want to read Vonnegut. I mean, the thing that to me, other than a personal friendship, the thing that stays with me the most about Kurt, the most, is his seriousness. Again, funny guy, deeply ironic, but he could be serious like nobody else. Like, here we are at this moment, we should all be, full of the kind of will to make change. It's absurd that we, cannot, turn the ship around in terms of global warming. But I've never seen, we should all be able to do it. But no, the only person well, not the only person, but almost unlike anybody else, was Kurt's ability to be deadly serious, and just to have the sense of, he loved people. He was really deeply gregarious, but he could there was one time at the National Arts Club where he was introducing Paul Krasner. Tom, I don't know if you know Paul Krasner, the creator of The Realist, the great American satirist. But he was a little guy and, kind of funny and kind of droopy. And, he was Lenny Bruce's best friend, and wrote helped Lenny Bruce write his autobiography. And Kurt said, "I'm introducing to you a national treasure." And people in the audience started laughing. They started laughing. And Kurt stopped dead and he glared at the audience. And after a few, he waited, maybe, count to 10, glaring at them. And then he said, when I'm saying something funny, I'll tell you. He was furious. And, that's so
awesome.
rare. That's Kurt Vonnegut.
I have a slightly different perspective, I think, to your question, Tom, which I think is a good one. It's actually a really good one. And I think that, and Kurt was the first person to admit that he never wrote a credible female character, and that he remained an unrepentant, I don't know what you would want to call it, not really misogynist, but he remained an unrepentant, dinosaur his entire life. Yeah. But I think that you can fruitfully look at his work in the context of, certainly Jane, his first wife's fingerprints are all over Slaughterhouse-Five. And in fact, and I was kind of surprised that you didn't mention it in your book, but the end of Slaughterhouse-Five with the bird ending the book is such a hugely important moment for him. And that comes out of Jane and Jane's love of the brothers Karamazov and the long speech in that story, in that novel, about asking forgiveness of the birds, and Jane's thesis at Swarthmore, which was about how no sense can be made of history because history is just full of horrors and there's nothing to be said about it. And so I think that, if we can take some of our more enlightened views of things and look at the books and look at what he said about them and what other people have said about them, and kind of switch our perspective a little bit.
And to the way you phrased it, Tom, about making the room bigger, I don't think we have to usher people out of the room to make the room bigger. That the room can just get bigger. We can invite more people in.
Right. It's not a zero-sum game. And I was about to say that, there's room on our bookshelves for a couple of Vonnegut books, I hope.
Absolutely. Just a quick announcement too, to our audience members, if you'd like to submit a question in the chat here, we will pivot to audience questions soon. So hit us with anything you got. We'd love to talk about it.
Bring it.
Yes, absolutely. Moving, something you said earlier in this conversation, Ginger, about how it's simply an excellent, ambitious novel on a structural level. So if we part with the question of science fiction, I still want to parse what is special about it in this way, about the metafiction and the unreality of the novel. Tom, in your book, you mentioned that Vonnegut's editor dissuaded him from putting the name Vonnegut on a tombstone of a narrator's relative in a different book. Supposedly that was too genre bending. It strikes me that that's really ahead of its time. If I read a work of speculative literary fiction today where a writer did that, people would love it. They would think that's so funny. What literary lineage emerged from his experimentation with form in Slaughterhouse-Five?
I mean, you could say that he was part of the whole new journalism, but I mean, postmodernism, really it was happening at the same time, right? And this whole notion of metafiction, where the author breaks down the line between fiction and nonfiction, and an author who will actually point the reader to look at the literary process itself. I mean, we live with that every day now, where a character will be in a movie and suddenly look at the screen and start talking to you. It's no one even notices it anymore. But at the time, when Vonnegut plunks himself into that first chapter of Slaughterhouse-Five and just says, "This is who I am," and then he just drops himself through the book in such clever ways. And even though it's a story about Billy Pilgrim, I mean, I'm way too young to have experienced it at the time when it came out, but it must have been insane when you first read that book and then you saw that happen. It was so before its time.
Yeah, it's almost ahead of its time now, because even books that would use some of those techniques now, they won't do it as much as Kurt does it in Slaughterhouse, But I mean, and Ginger, the point well taken on that. But again, he's a man of his times, so even though he was productive and, writing into this millennium, it's just so rare for male writers of that period to be able to write women characters well. I mean, you can really list on one hand those who are able to, but it's still a good point.
Mhm.
I mean, in terms of the technical achievements, I think I love the fact that you used that section, Dan. You chose that the film backwards scene, because I think that's so indicative of one of Vonnegut's ability to write about elemental, simple things, like a movie going backwards. It seems like nothing, and yet when you read it, it's so powerful, because it's what we all want. We all want to turn back time. We all want to see our lives turn over again, especially anyone who's been in a war. And to have done it so seamlessly with just this kind of goofy moment where Billy Pilgrim is watching a film it shows that he was so technically astute, and yet you don't see it. And he was often discredited. He was seen as like he's too accessible, too easy to read.
Yeah.
But easy is so hard to do.
It might be true too. I mean, if you talk to a physicist, I have friends who are physicists. I mean, they'll say it too. We don't understand the first thing about time yet. And it is nice to think that maybe all these things coexist, and time goes in both directions. And that, I mean, it's ingenious the way he did it, but it might be true.
It's the eternal return, Nietzsche, all this stuff. This guy, Matt Molina, told me all this stuff about, it was in my book, was like, get this very deep philosophy, but somehow he dances on all above it. And Vonnegut was very well read. His whole family said he was constantly reading. So he knew what he was talking about.
I think that's the thing that is most often overlooked when it comes to Vonnegut, is his erudition. I mean, the man is incredibly... Player Piano opens with a not a quotation, but it's a reference to Caesar's conquest of Gaul. And it's full of, he's extremely well read and extremely constantly, bringing these things into his work, but he does it with such a light touch that you just don't think that. I mean, and the whole Dan saying it might be true. In fact, he borrowed the notion of synchronous time from Norbert Wiener, who was the inventor of cybernetics. So, and that was a book that he read when he was working at GE. He actually sent a copy of Player Piano to Norbert Wiener.
Yes,
Yeah, the discussion of like whether or not he's a science fiction writer, that what I often think about now is that more than science fiction, I think it's been mentioned already, he was a technology writer. And nowadays with the technology is so cool, and tech writers are like the hip thing today. That's what Vonnegut was. He was a tech writer who was able to turn those ideas into fiction.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Mhm.
He was constantly thinking about technology.
Yeah, and to write that simply, I mean, it's a little bit like Henry David Thoreau or something, the simplicity of what he's writing and what he's writing about coming out of deep erudition. You'd never know that Thoreau was a classicist, which he was, and that sort of thing.
It looks like we've got a few audience questions here, and do keep them coming, but we'll start with what we've got. Dave G asks, Slaughterhouse-Five had the subtitle The Children's Crusade. Since the armies know that it is best to grab young men in later puberty, do you think that is why his books speak to young people?
I mean, the character, yeah, is a young person who is swept up into war. I think it's actually, it makes me think of new thoughts about how a lot of his books they go into the source of childhood, and how a lot of his characters have these traumatic experiences early on. And I think Vonnegut himself was very attuned to his own childhood. I think we briefly mentioned, I mean, he had a glorious, wonderful childhood in many ways. He was very rich, but he also had immense tragedy when his mother killed herself. There's some dispute about whether or not she intentionally did it, but she overdosed on barbiturates on Mother's Day. And I think he was very tuned into what it feels like to be young and the highs and the lows of it. And I think you do see it in all of his novels, really.
Mhm. A second question here. Any legacy issues for the novels citing David Irving?
I didn't hear that.
Say that again?
Sure.
The David Irving, the anti-Semite.
Yes, Adam Weiss asks any legacy issues with that citation.
I think so a little bit. In my book, I kept on looking into that because just to give people a background, David Irving wrote this book about the Dresden bombing, and it was, I think it came out in the 50s or early 60s, and Vonnegut cites it and uses it as the number for how many German civilians were killed in Dresden. It was about 125,000 that he had used. Later on, it turns out David Irving is this raging anti-Semite and a nut job, and he made up stuff. And so he was not a good source. And that bothered me all the time. I mean, I talked to a lot of people about it because his kids said they didn't really know what he did with it. But I spoke to Mark Leeds, who wrote the Vonnegut Encyclopedia, and he said that he asked him the same question about it, if he had an issue with him. And Vonnegut's point basically was that still a lot of people died. So, whether it's 125,000 or there was a separate report that was actually put out by a German commission that actually suggested that it was more like 25,000 actually were killed. So whether it's 25,000 or 125,000 doesn't really matter. It was still an atrocity. Now, the fact that he still has this anti-Semite in his book, it's kind of a problem to me.
There's a question in the text. So, it just about the question of whether he would want to be thought of as a comedian or tragedian. This idea of Kurtz that we don't know what's the good. Tom, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You mentioned it at least once in the book, but we don't know what's the good news and what's the bad news. It's one of his most elegant, beautiful, but also founding ideas. And he did say it, it's just, it's like a koan, but yeah, I mean, do you want to speak to that?
Well, what was the question? Does anyone know? Can you repeat what the question was?
Do you think he would see himself, Kurt, as a comedian, tragedian, both, or something else?
Oh, yeah, again, I don't think he'd like to be put in categories, but yeah, no, I think that's probably it's one of my favorite things that he said, that you don't know the good news from the bad news. And I think about that all the time. I say that to my kids all the time. You just don't, something bad happens to you and then it turns out it has a good result, right? But it does put me in mind, frankly, of Dave Chappelle. I hate to say it, but comedians, they are often, not necessarily Dave Chappelle, but comedians are often our truth tellers, right? I mean, they're the ones who are able to look at the world and see the darkness, and they turn it into a joke. And so, you know, whether it's Steve Martin or Lenny Bruce or, you know, right. So I currently love Mark Maron, who's like a really funny a podcaster, comedian. You know, comedians get to see the darkness and twist it and make a joke of it and allow us to really digest it in many ways. And I think that's what Vonnegut did.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like they're two sides of the same coin in a way, comedy and tragedy, right? And one of the things that's fun about Bob Whitey's documentary that's coming out this month is how often Kurt says, you know, on camera, will say something really dark and then just crack up all over himself, like, you know, and you see that those things are just wedded for him.
Yeah. Well said.
I think Cat's Cradle is like 99 chapters, and he said he structured every chapter as a joke. That was the structure. It was like punchline, and then, you know, set up to the punchline.
I mean, and I think he really looked up to his readers in a sense, or what I consider looking up to his readers. Like, he knew they'd get it. I love that about him. And it's interesting that after Slaughterhouse became such a huge hit, the next book he writes, Breakfast of Champions, which really offended a lot of people and maybe still does, you know, it's almost like he's pushing the envelope even further, maybe unconsciously, but.
We've got an interesting question here from Mariette. When reading Slaughterhouse-Five, I'm often reminded of the Freudian idea of reliving trauma as an attempt to rewrite the event to conclude in a way more appealing to the victim. Is there a connection with recent trends toward revisionist history, attempting to negate facts to portray events, most notably the Holocaust or American slavery, in a more favorable light?
Can one of you guys paraphrase the better than me, the great quote in Slaughterhouse-Five where he, they use science fiction to rewrite their lives? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, is this about Kilgore Trout when they become obsessed with the books?
Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
So I'll try to paraphrase it. Billy Pilgrim, he says that they were using science fiction to rewrite their lives. He outward says exactly what you're addressing. That yes, science fiction, writing, rewriting, people are trying to rewrite their lives in different ways. And it's so poignant when people try to do that.
Mhm. This is an interesting connection, though, to erasing historical events and negating the facts of that. Do you think there's any presence of that in the novel?
I don't think so. I think that's different. I mean, that's a really sinister form of maybe something that is related in some distant way. But I you know, Kurt doesn't do that. That's a, you know, I don't think it is related. I mean, yes, you know, everything's related, but I think it's different.
Yeah, when you
No,
think about the passage that Dan read of where you know, Dresden goes in reverse, that's not, he's clearly not attempting to suggest that there's any universe in which it didn't happen.
Right.
Right? There's a way of looking at things that can unspool it or run it backwards, but
not falsify it. It's almost like Kurt could do this, could kind of, the imagination could be very playful, could be healing, and at the same time almost respectful of what actually happened. You know, it's not, you know, creating fake facts or whatever.
Mhm.
yeah.
Adrian, do you see, I think in the
Yeah.
chat, someone's got the quote that I was trying to do.
Oh, yeah.
Very helpful. Thank you to Matthew. The quote is, so they were trying to reinvent themselves and their universe. Science fiction was a big help. I love
Exactly.
that.
I mean, you know, the imagination is so important. You have to be able, you know, even like now in America today, you've got to be able to imagine, people have to be able to imagine what that better world would look like in order to make it, you know, and the minute that people are unable to imagine it, then, you know, one is in a really desperate situation. And maybe we are in that desperate situation now. You got to be able to imagine it. And I mean, it's almost like Kurt has us work our imagination muscles, you know, really, he's good at that.
Mhm.
You know, I think it's really interesting what you were saying before, Adrian, about whether or not people can rewrite the past. Although Dan, you said, maybe they're not related, but I think it's a similar thing where these are two sides of a coin, where there's a dark side and a light side. I mean, to me, I was thinking about fake news. Okay. Fake news used to be this really biting satire that Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert used to wield, right? And now it means something totally different. And I think that's something that Vonnegut was dealing with. He a lot of what he was handling was with truth and depicting truth in very creative, imaginative ways, but that can be used by dark forces as well. In fact, it makes me think of Mother Night for a moment, his novel. But,
Yeah, that's true.
Mhm. Just a quick note to our audience, we will be out of time here in 5 or 10 minutes. So any questions you want to get in under the wire, send them to us now. This is an interesting one though from Jeff. Maybe one of you knows the answer. What did Kurt Vonnegut think of the Slaughterhouse-Five movie? Do any of you know?
I think he liked it. Didn't you say he liked it in your book, Tom? Or did I?
yeah, he loved it.
Yeah.
He loved it. Which frankly, I loved it too when I was 18, but I watched it again. I have to tell you, I don't think it holds up.
Dan,
Dan, what do you think?
I don't remember. I went with Kurt to see Mother Night, but I don't remember. I've seen the Slaughterhouse movie, but I don't remember it or what Kurt thought of it. But I do have a theory, which is that Kurt, as this, quintessential stylist in the American idiom, is almost untranslatable, into anything. It's really funny. It's really funny to see Kurt in French or even in German, even though you would think the German was kind of in his DNA. He doesn't translate well.
Well, one of the reasons is,
but yeah,
I think one of the reasons is that you need to have Kurt in the movie. You can't have just the story because
that's very
Rosewater,
yeah.
with
Yeah.
Rosewater on, he's always a character as a metafictional presence in his novels. And so if you take him out and it's just the story, it doesn't hold up as well.
Yeah, but I
He's
think
also inimitable, right? And it's one of the great, I'm sure you faced this pitfall too when you were writing your book, Tom, and congratulations on not falling into it. That there's always this temptation to try to write like Kurt when you're writing about Kurt. And it's tragic if you can't fend it off, because nobody can write like Kurt.
yeah, it's hard to do, but he doesn't translate well into film. He doesn't in my opinion, doesn't translate easily into anything other than the way he created it in English, on the written page.
There was talk of doing a series adaptation of Slaughterhouse-Five a few years ago. They might still do it. Who knows?
I think I know
Is there
someone who's working on that actually, as a music.
is there any
Okay.
director working today that any of you would trust to take Slaughterhouse-Five and do it right?
As a film.
Or a miniseries, any sort of film format?
David O. Russell. I'll throw him out there.
Mhm.
He's wacky, but smart enough to do it, I think.
Very difficult one. David
Let's
Sullivan.
see if we have any other questions coming in here.
Alan Ball, good one.
Cersei asks, I'm curious about the reference to Celine in the beginning. Are there any interesting parallels between Slaughterhouse-Five and Journey to the End of the Night?
I think that's a great question. Kurt gave me a book about, he was pretty obsessed with that book. And I was really interested to see that in your book. It made me want to go back to Celine. I think that was important to him. Yeah.
Yeah, I picked up a couple of Celine books recently, and man, they're heavy and they're dense, but they're also imaginative, and also he's frankly another anti-Semite, so problems there. Yeah, I mean, he definitely used Celine. I mean, Celine had very insightful thoughts about memory and death and just how awful, being human can be sometimes. But there are a lot of traps there too.
Mhm. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. We don't have any more questions coming in and we're out of time here. So I want to say thank you to the Brooklyn Public Library for having us here tonight. Thank you to each and every one of you panelists. This has been such a rousing, lively, fun conversation. I'm very grateful to have been a part of it. And thank you to our audience for joining us. We really were glad to have you here with us.
Yes. this
Thank
was
you,
fun.
everybody.
All right. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Thanks,
Good
everyone.
night.
Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Adrian.